The evening began with Rabbi Micah Greenstein of Memphis, reading from the sermon of Rabbi James Wax, given on April 5, 1968, the day after Dr. King's assassination.
Martin Luther King was a prophet like Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah, a man who walked in the footsteps of Moses and Jesus. He fought to break the chains that have oppressed people. He sought to give men dignity. He sought to make this a better world in which to live. Martin Luther King was one of the greatest men ever because he personified the greatest teachings of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and he did it without violence. He appealed to the heart and the conscience of mankind.
The first guests of the night were on hand to discuss the early years of the civil rights movement. Civil rights activists Reverend C.T. Vivian, Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, and Dr. Dorothy Cotton.
But we were in Selma, Alabama, and as Wyatt says, is that Birmingham was the high point of the movement, but that was before we went to Selma, you see. And because I say Selma is because that's where we were seeking. That was the one that was going to make the difference. If we could win in Selma, that would make all the difference. And we had fought the good fight through months of Selma. And then came that night, but we would know whether we won. Because the idea was to move the President of the United States, was to move Congress, was to move this nation to do the right thing about the right to vote. That was the meaning of Selma. We went there to get the right to vote.
Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
And we cheered. We were sitting around the floor and in the chairs. There was only about 4 or 5 of us, right? And we cheered. We looked at each other. We got up off the floor. We were moving. And then we looked over at Martin. And Martin had not moved, nor had the expression on his face. But there was a tear coming down his cheek. It was just quietly moving, if I can say it that way. And we knew that we had accomplished what we had come for. And we knew that Martin was satisfied for what we had done. And all of us together across this nation had moved it to do the right thing. When we had gone to Johnson before, he said in so many words, "Make me do it." In other words, I'm willing if you can make me do it. I've got to sell Congress. We not only sold Congress, we sold the nation. And that's the great change. That's the great change.
When I think about Martin Luther King, differently from most people, I think about his great humor. I remember a line I saw in Time magazine once. It said, "The unsmiling Dr. King," but they didn't know he had such a funny bone. Right. And I'm going to use part of my time to tell you one of the jokes which tickled him the most. When I first came to SCLC, one of my chief responsibilities was to get ready for the annual meeting of SCLC in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was like the advanced man. I went up and got things together. And Dr. King said to me, he said, "Now Wyatt," said, "I know you have to have big churches for the rallies, but I want you to include in some way the smaller churches and the so-called smaller preachers." So I tried to follow what he said. And I went up to Nashville and I picked out a small church called the Mount Zion AME Church for the registration office. And I called back to SCLC and told Dr. King what I had done, and everything was okay. And he and Ralph Abernathy came up the day before the convention, and they drove over into the black section of town, and they were looking for somebody to ask about where this little church was. And there was a fellow standing on the corner with a bill cap turned sideways, and his head was kind of bobbing. And so they stopped and asked him where the Mount Zion AME church was. He said, "That's Ralph Habersnatcher, isn't it?" And Ralph said, "Yes." He said, "That's Martin Luther King." He said, "Yes." And he said, "I tell you, Dr. King," said, "keep right on down the street till you get to the high school and hang right down there, and you go to the lumber yard. No, Dr. King, turn right here and go up to the supermarket about 3 blocks, and when you get to the red light, turn left." And he stopped. He said, "Dr. King, I don't believe I know where that church is."